But before I introduce our guest, Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT, I want to let you know that I've made a concession to one of our frequent callers who has always asked me the question, what has this topic got to do with Islam? And it's an important observation because the program, after all, is named Radio Islam. So tonight, as you listen to the program, I wonder if you could try to discern or figure out what, if anything, this program's topic has to do with Islam. And then I'll try to suggest something at the end. Tonight, our guest, this has been said about him. The United States has a long history of critical intellectuals, but Chomsky does not quite fit into any American tradition of protest. He is not a part of that long line of critics from Emerson and Thoreau to J. William Fulbright and Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who bemoaned America's betrayal of his promise. He does not share the belief that America is a city on a hill, a nation that operates according to principles radically different from others, or that this is a country in which ideas flow relatively freely and without discrimination, where the truth generally wins out over falsehood. Nor does he accept a vision of America as a well-intentioned, morally inclined power whose ideas embody the best aspirations of America or of mankind. No American dream is a part of his beliefs, and this is our guest this evening, Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, can you hear us?
I can.
Sir, I cannot tell you how much of an honor it is for me to be sitting here in Radio Islam Studios and interviewing you. I just watched a video of you, DVD, where you were making several talks. I think someone has made several videos of you. I don't want to waste the audience's time, sir. I want to get as much information out of you as possible. Okay. And I'm very honored to be addressing someone whose intellect has been developed in the strong line of spectacular Jewish scholarship. And I understand that your father himself was a Jewish scholar, a Hebrew scholar.
Correct, he was. A noted one, in fact.
Again, Dr. Chomsky, welcome. And our first question is, where are we Americans headed as a people?
Well, it's a big question. Actually, there are many different Americas. So to make a first step towards an appropriate division, there is, on the one hand, a governing elite, which happens to be bipartisan. There's very little difference between the parties. So the political parties, the managers of the corporate system with which they're closely linked, the media, which are part of the system, that's one America. The other America is the public. And in fact, the division between them is extraordinary. It showed up very dramatically during the election campaign. So just to illustrate, the public opinion in the United States is very closely monitored. So we know a lot about it. And just before the election, two of the major institutions, most respectable and quite excellent ones, in fact, that monitor public opinion, that came out with major studies of a whole host of critical issues timed for the election. One was the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, which monitors attitudes on international affairs, and the other was the Program on International Policy Attitudes of the University of Maryland, which is a major academic polling institution in the world. They were barely reported, nothing in the national press, and scattered elsewhere. And if you look at the conclusions of what they discovered, you can sort of guess why. They showed that the two political parties and the media are far to the right of the general public on issue after issue. We can just run through the list. The large majority of the public supports signing the Kyoto Protocol, which both parties were opposed to, supports the U.S. joining the International Criminal Court, accepting the jurisdiction of the World Court, is in favor of, the large majority is in favor of ceding responsibility to the United Nations for taking the lead in international crises. That includes, incidentally, reconstruction, political transition, and security in Iraq. In fact, the majority of the public even is in favor of the U.S. giving up the veto at the United Nations and accepting the decisions of others, even if we don't like them. A large majority is opposed to the use of force in international affairs, except under very narrow conditions, essentially the conditions of the United Nations Charter, which are rejected by both political parties. Overwhelming majorities in favor of domestic spending, health care about 80%, education and Social Security close to that. And with regard to the Middle East, to say take the Israel-Arab conflict, the proportion of the population that's in favor of tilting towards Israel is 17%. In other words, very little.
17%?
17%. Fair opinion to the bipartisan media consensus, elite consensus, basically. What you see is a very sharp divide, and that explains the way the elections are run. If you look at the election campaigns, you discover that these issues didn't come up. In fact, issues barely came up at all.
The candidates themselves were the issues.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The way elections are now run in the United States is kind of like selling toothpaste. Not surprising, because the campaigns are run by the public relations industry, which in its normal life, its normal activity is selling toothpaste or other commodities. When you turn on the television and you see an ad, you don't expect the ad to be telling you the truth about the commodity that they're advertising. They're trying to project an image which will somehow delude you into purchasing, say, this car instead of another equivalent car. And they're not telling you the characteristics of it. They're showing you, a beautiful actress driving it, or a football player, or the car.
Hearing you say that, and I want you to continue your answer, I said, hearing you talk about public relations brings to mind Karl Rove, and I don't know if you're aware of the video called Bush's Brain.
There's a bit I know. Yeah.
And it talks about that he may well be running the country, a co-president, if you will.
Well, see, I don't really believe that. For years, the public relations industry has been running elections. They sell images of candidates just the way they sell other commodities. But after that, they're not in power anymore. Power is in the hands of the same sectors that always dominated, with some shifts. So, for example, there is a difference between the group around the Bush administration and the group around Kerry. So there's a difference between sort of a center-right Kerry position and a extremist right Bush position. But they're within a pretty narrow consensus on most issues, and strikingly very different from the public, which is why issues cannot enter the campaign, and why it's based on selling imagery, projecting images, and trying to delude the public into accepting them, and why public opinion has to be suppressed. So it's actually quite a remarkable comment on the state of American democracy that the major studies of public opinion released right before the election are virtually unknown and scarcely reported, as I mentioned, in the national press, never even mentioned.
And with regards to our relationship with the rest of the world, is the world going to continue, in your opinion, as a unipolar world?
It's very unlikely. Nobody can really predict human affairs, but just about every serious mainstream analyst that I know, right in the heart of the establishment, is expecting that the militarism and aggressiveness and rejection of international order that the United States has been pursuing is going to lead to significant counterforces, which will respond to it, and in fact already are responding to it, and are likely to cause serious threats and dangers. In fact, one of the most prominent strategic analysts in the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, very sober journal, just warned that the U.S. policies carry, in his words, an appreciable threat of ultimate doom as other powers react to them. And that's not impossible. So, for example, the invasion of Iraq was undertaken with the expectation by the administration that it would very likely increase the threat of terror around the world, as it did, and that it would increase the threat of proliferation of nuclear weapons, as it also did. And their military programs are predictably elsewhere having the same effect. I mean, Russia, for example, during the Bush years, has sharply expanded its military spending. Just about a year ago, it carried out its first major military operations, in 2 decades, demonstrating new offensive missiles, nuclear weapons targeting the United States, very sophisticated ones. It's adopted the Bush administration first strike doctrine. Its weapons, like ours, are on hair trigger alert, computer controlled, which is just waiting for an accident to happen. China, which so far has been quite restrained, is also beginning to follow the same course, expanding its military capacity, offensive military capacity significantly. All of this has a ripple effect. If China expands its offensive capacity, India is very likely to do so in reaction, which means Pakistan will as well. That then spreads beyond. All of this significantly, and this is not the only thing by any means, significantly heightens the threat of just accidental nuclear war. Now, that's quite apart from environmental disasters and others, which are just not considered. You know, there is a kind of a radical right takeover of policymaking, which is causing very deep concern right at the heart of the establishment, and has caused the United States to become very quickly the most feared and often hated country in the world, which is very bad.
Right, it is a terrible situation, and one of the situations that America finds itself in, which is a stew of our own cooking, is this so-called America's war on terrorism. How do you react to that phrase?
Well, first of all, we ought to put it in a little bit of historical context. There was a war on terror that was declared in 1981 by the Reagan administration as soon as it came into office. Now, the Reagan administration is pretty much the people currently in power. The people now in office are sort of at the extremist end of the Reagan administration, but it's pretty much the same people or their immediate mentors otherwise. And they declared a war on terror. They described terror as a plague that's about to destroy civilization itself, return to barbarism in the modern world. And they carried out what they called an extensive war against terror. Actually, it was a war of terror. Wouldn't surprise anyone who knows any history. It was a war of terror in Central America, which was the main target. It left hundreds of thousands of corpses, 4 countries seriously damaged, if not destroyed. The U.S. was brought to the World Court and sentenced. It's the first country to have been condemned for what amounts to international terrorism. It's called unlawful use of force. Ordered to terminate the crime. The U.S. disregarded it, escalated the war.
This was in Guatemala?
Nicaragua. Most of this is just suppressed in the doctrinal system. But the fact is that the U.S. is the only country to have rejected a World Court decision, and currently, and to have in fact escalated the crime after it was condemned. The World Court decision was also confirmed by 2 Security Council resolutions, which the United States vetoed. All of this is, almost 20 years ago. The Middle East was another center of the so-called war on terror, and there too the United States backed or carried out extreme terrorist actions. Some of them, again, strongly condemned by the Security Council and the international community. So, for example, just to take one, when in 1985, but take, say, the year 1985, an interesting year, Middle East terrorism was the top story of the year in 1985 in a poll of international editors, American and international editors. And in fact, there was plenty of terrorism in 1985. But the worst acts of terrorism are never even mentioned in the Middle East. Now, the most extreme act of terror in the Middle East in 1985 was a car bombing in Beirut, which was car bombing right outside a mosque, timed to go off a huge explosion just as people were leaving the mosque. Killed about 80 people, wounded over several hundred, mostly women and girls. It turned out the explosion was so huge that children were killed in beds, blocks away. Why doesn't that enter the annals of terror? Well, very simple reason. It was organized by the CIA and British intelligence, apparently with the cooperation of Saudi intelligence, aimed at killing a Muslim cleric, Sheikh Fadlallah, who they missed.
Are you still there?
Because of the origin of the action, namely the United States, it doesn't enter the annals of terror.
Oh, given what you said, then, if there's really no such thing as a war on terror, how do we classify the militaristic efforts of this country against Afghanistan and Iraq, and the threat against Iran?
These are it's mostly traditional imperial power, and the exercise of power for rather traditional ends, and it always requires pretexts. For a long time, the pretext for subversion and violence was the alleged threat of communism. And by the early 80s, it was beginning to be clear that that's not going to work very much, so the threat of terror was invented. More recently, it's been what they call rogue states, Clinton's invention. Then after 9/11, it became a war on terror again, redeclaring the war, notice, and also in almost all the same terms as the original. Now, it's not that the threat is non-existent. In fact, it's very serious. Terrorism striking the United States is a very serious threat. I mean, that's been known since 1993, at least for the people who read the newspapers. After all, it was in 1993 that the World Trade Center
was the first bombing
destroyed by a bombing apparently carried out by jihadi radicals who had been organized and trained and armed by the CIA in the 1980s for their own purposes. Then some of them brought into the United States under CIA protection. They happened to carry out a major bombing in New York, which almost succeeded and probably would have killed tens of thousands of people if it had. Ever since then, it's certainly been obvious that the threat of terror from these jihadist elements is serious. And it's right through the 1990s. There were warnings from strategic analysts, academic sources, high-level government commissions that there's a significant threat of that form of terror in the United States. When it finally happened on September 11th, it was a terrible atrocity, but not really unanticipated. It was clear that something like that was going to happen. Probably, you can't predict it. And it's likely now that there will be something else like it. And in fact, it's commonly expected in high-level analyses and predicted that sooner or later this kind of jihadi-style terror and weapons of mass destruction will be united with perhaps horrendous consequences.
How do you explain, Dr. Chomsky, given the sources or the expected sources of threats against the United States, being primarily in the Middle East, the inclusion of North Korea in an axis of evil?
North Korea is a country, an axis of evil consists of countries that are not accepting U.S. orders. So why is Cuba listed as a terrorist, a state that supports terror, for example? Is Cuba supporting terror? Well, let's take Syria. Why is Syria in the Middle East? Why is Syria on the list of states supporting terrorism? Does the U.S. take that seriously? Well, we can easily test that. About 10 years ago, Clinton offered to remove Syria from the list of states supporting terrorism. There's about 7. If Syria agreed to U.S.-Israeli proposals for the settlement of the Golan Heights issue. Well, Syria insisted on regaining all of its territory, so it stayed on the list of states supporting terror. U.S. intelligence doesn't accuse Syria of being any involvement in terror. In fact, Syria has been very cooperative with the United States in trying to uproot Al-Qaeda-style terror, which it strongly opposes. And in fact, the Bush administration and Congress have undercut that cooperation. So a year ago, Congress passed what was called the Syria Accountability Act, which called for they passed it nearly unanimously, calling for severe sanctions on Syria. They were later implemented by the U.S. That cuts off Syrian cooperation with the United States in the so-called war on terror. The reason is not that Syria is involved in terror, it's that it's not following U.S. orders. Same with North Korea. In fact, if you look at the Syria Accountability Act, the hypocrisy is mind-boggling. The charge against Syria, which happens to affect, is that it's interfering in the affairs of Lebanon. There is a UN, the congressional resolution, Senate House resolution, was based on a UN Security Council resolution calling on all countries to stop interfering with the internal affairs of Lebanon. However, what they suppressed and what the press kept quiet about is that resolution was passed against Israel, not against Syria. And it was passed about, I think, in 1980 or 82, maybe, calling on Israel to stop its interference with the internal affairs of Lebanon. Well, was Israel ever sanctioned for that over 18 years of violating it?
I think sanctions were ordered by the UN, but I think they were never carried out.
No, I mean, the U.S. it was not even conceivable that the U.S. would permit any such action to be taken. But now this very same resolution, very same one, aimed against Israel, which Israel violated with U.S. support for 18 years, that resolution is now used as the basis for charging Syria with criminal action and imposing sanctions, and incidentally, thereby undercutting an important supportive ally in the so-called war on terror. Well, that tells you again just how seriously the war on terror is taken. In fact, the invasion of Iraq tells you. The invasion of Iraq was undertaken with the expectation that it would probably lead to an increase in terror, as it did.
Really? Say that again?
The war on Iraq, it was predicted by intelligence agencies, including the U.S. intelligence agencies and other specialists, strategic institutes, and so on. It was predicted that the war against Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, very likely to increase the threat of terror. And as we now know, that's just what happened.
Professor Chomsky, we want to take our first break, and can you be in there with us for another couple of minutes?
Sure.
Okay. This is Radio Islam coming to you from WCEV Radio, Cicero, Illinois. We're on the air now with Professor Noam Chomsky, MIT Professor of Linguistics. Professor Chomsky, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
The show prior to the break is rich with the kind of information that a person like yourself provides. A personal question. With whom do you hold conversations?
People all over the place. A lot of it interviews, a lot of it talks all over the country with often huge audiences. I don't know, maybe 100 letters every night. Just endless discussion.
And as I understand it from watching this recent DVD concerning you, linguistics really doesn't play into what you are doing now and what you have also acquired great renown for. Is that a true statement?
That linguistics doesn't enter into it?
It's not the reason why you're into this?
Nothing to do with it. In fact, I've been involved in these activities actually ever since I was a young teenager.
Professor Chomsky, I read something about you and your education. America's education system is one of comparison of students' scores against standardized tests. But that was a little different for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was quite lucky. My parents were very much involved in the progressive education movement, the Deweyite movement. They were both teachers. They were Hebrew teachers, so they were away, afternoons and Sundays. From the time I was a baby, before I was 2, I was in a nursery school, later a school, but it was a progressive school, an experimental school run by Temple University on Deweyite principles, and there just was no comparison of the idea of comparison of students never even arose. In fact, until I left that, had to leave that school, which ended in 8th grade, and went to the local academic high school. That was the first time I ever discovered that I was what was called a good student, getting all A's.
That was the time you started being compared against group scores or standardized scores.
Before that, it just wasn't an issue. Each person was expected to do the kind of work that they were able to do and wanted to do, and were encouraged to carry it out, often cooperatively. But there was just no ranking. In fact, I realized later, I didn't pay much attention to it at the time, that I had been skipped a year. So I was the littlest kid in the class. But it didn't strike, nobody thought of that as having anything to do with academic performance.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, and I hope that members of our public school society heard that comment. How is it that someone of Jewish parents turns out to be referred to as an anti-Semite?
Actually, this concept of anti-Semite is an interesting one. For those who had a good Jewish education, like I did, they should know exactly where it comes from. It comes from the Bible. In the Bible, King Ahab, who was, the evil king, the epitome of evil in the Bible, was furious because the prophet Elijah was criticizing the king, criticizing his policies, calling for justice and proper, decent treatment of people, and so on. Ahab called King Ahab called Elijah to him and asked him, "Why are you a hater of Israel?" Okay, that's what's now called, self-hating Jew or anti-Semite or something. And the king, you can understand his point. The king identifies the people, the society, the culture, and so on with himself. So if you criticize the policies of the evil king, you're a hater of Israel. Well, if you criticize the policies of the state of Israel, you must be anti-Semitic. It's the same thing, goes straight back to King Ahab. And it's a way of deflecting, of trying to protect state power from criticism. It's not uncommon in totalitarian states. It's quite common. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, dissidents, and critics in the Soviet Union were harshly condemned as what was called anti-Soviet. If you're against the policies of the Kremlin, you must be against the society and its people and its culture and so on.
Aren't we seeing that now in the United States with the neocons and the conservative right radio and their diatribes against Americans who would dare speak against the country?
In fact, the concept anti-American is exactly the same. People are called anti-American if they criticize the policies of the government. just as the prophet Elijah was called a hater of Israel because he criticized the policy of the king. In fact, in countries that have any, that take democracy seriously, this would be considered a silly joke. I mean, suppose that in Italy, let's say, someone criticizes the policies of Prime Minister Berlusconi. Would he be called anti-Italian? I mean, if there was a book in Italy published called The Anti-Italians, meaning people who criticize the government, people would crack up in laughter. But in the United States, there are books like that called The Anti-Americans, and they're highly respected. But that's a reflection of the subordination of a good part of the intellectual culture, the elite culture, to real totalitarian ideals.
Let me quote, recite a quote that is attributed to you on this point of browbeating people and keeping people under control, totalitarian societies. Quote, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum, even encourage the more critical and dissonant views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on that range of debate." I know this is kind of heady stuff for our audience, but what does that mean?
Well, let's take any case you like. So right now, for example, there's a huge debate going on about whether the United Nations was responsible for corruption in the sanctions regime.
Oil for food.
The oil for food regime, and whether, the charges that they stole $10 billion and so on and so forth. Norm Coleman and Congress and others. And critics are responding that no, it isn't true, and in fact, it was only $1.5 billion, and besides, the United States was supervising it. And so a debate rages between people who are making the charges and the people who are refuting them. Actually, the people who are refuting them are correct. Most of the responsibility falls right back into the hands of the United States. But it really doesn't matter, because the entire discussion is an effort to evade the major issue, which is not being discussed. The major issue is that the sanctions were murderous and brutal. I mean, they killed hundreds of thousands of people by conservative estimates. They forced the country for 10 years. They forced the population to be dependent on Saddam Hussein for survival. They prevented him from being overthrown. I mean, if the sanctions had been removed and the civil society had been able to reconstruct, it's very likely that the people of Iraq would have sent Saddam to the same fate as a whole series of other murderous tyrants who were supported by the people who are in Washington right now, like Ceausescu in Romania, or Suharto in Indonesia, or Marcos in the Philippines, Mobutu. I mean, there's a whole long series of them. They were all overthrown from within. Well, the Iraqi people were prevented from doing this because they were, in fact, devastated. Society was devastated. It was barely functioning, and they were compelled to rely for survival on the, turns out, quite efficient food and other distribution system run by the tyrant. Well, that's the topic we ought to be discussing. The murderous sanctions, the mass murder of millions of hundreds of thousands of people, and the effects of it. But that's not being discussed at all. What we discuss is the secondary, marginal question of whether the charges against the UN for corruption are correct. That's a very effective technique for preventing thought.
Your signal is fading out just a little bit, Professor Chomsky.
I said that's a very effective device for here you focus, you have a lively, exciting debate on a 10th-rate issue in which the charges will be proven to be false, but meanwhile they will have succeeded, because they will have the debate itself will have diverted attention from the real issue. And in fact, there's an even the same is true of the invasion of Iraq itself. So, for example, right now there's a debate about are the insurgents terrorists or resistors or whatever. That's not the issue. The issue is, what's the United States doing invading Iraq? I mean, that's the invasion of Iraq is what the Nuremberg Tribunal called the supreme international crime.
One thing you said on this point, Professor Chomsky, you're quoted as having said, quote, "I think we can be reasonably confident that if the American population had the slightest idea of what is being done in their name, they would be utterly appalled," unquote.
I think that's true. In fact, take, say again, the invasion of Iraq. That's a dramatic case. The studies that I mentioned before show that about 75% of the population thinks the United States should not have invaded Iraq if it did not have weapons of mass destruction and if it did not have links to Al-Qaeda and involvement in 9/11. Well, no, it's been shown without question by government investigations on the highest level that there were no weapons of mass destruction and there were no links to Al-Qaeda. In fact, just today, the government quietly announced that it's removing from Iraq all weapons inspectors because they're never going to find anything.
One other thing, Professor Chomsky, and we're coming to a close of the program after about 5 minutes or so. You said earlier, and this is a question from a caller, did you say earlier that, if you did say earlier that Israel only appreciates 17% support in America, how do we explain the most favored nation status aid that they receive from this country in the billions of dollars annually?
Because the population does not make those decisions. In fact, the population does have views on aid, and we know what those are. A large majority of the population, like around probably 2/3, believes that the U.S. should cut off aid to either of the two parties, Israel or Palestine, that's refusing to enter into good faith negotiations on a political settlement. Well, that entails cutting off aid to Israel. And if both parties agree to negotiate, about the same majority of the population thinks the U.S. ought to equalize aid to them. I mean, does that have anything to do with policy? In fact, these things just aren't reported. The people who have those opinions must believe that each one must believe I'm the only person who thinks this. I mean, they've never heard anyone say it. If these things were allowed to be discussed, the positions would be held much more strongly.
Well, the question is, how is it that you and Howard Zinn and some other people know the things that you know, and the rest of us are sitting there chewing our fingernails? How do you get this information? How do you get to know what you know?
The information that I'm citing is from the most respectable sources that exist. In fact, this report these figures that I just mentioned are again from the leading polling institution in the world, the Program on International Policy Attitudes of the University of Maryland, which carried out an in-depth poll on this. The only way you can find out about it, because it wasn't reported, is to look it up on their website, or to read things like I've written about it, and a couple other people have written about it. So if you follow the independent news sources, like the internet sites that aren't under media control, ZNet, Common Dreams, and others, then you can find that material, or in the independent press, but it's marginal.
And you can also find material, and I want to cite a couple of your books, Dr. Chomsky, before we get ready to conclude. These are some books by Professor Noam Chomsky. Profit Over People, Washington Connection and Third World Fascism, Manufacturing Consent, and this is a great one, Propaganda and the Public Mind, and What Uncle Sam Really Wants. Dr. Chomsky, in the minutes remaining, I want to look at domestically. One quick question. Is Bush, by his invasion and its baselessness of Iraq and Afghanistan, has he put himself in the same stature as the people that he feels regimes have to be changed or removed? That's a caller's question.
We applied to ourselves the same standards we applied to others. He would be considered a criminal, a war criminal. In fact, the fact that you and your listeners, I'm sure, are aware that the new Attorney General, the coming Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales, was the legal advisor to the President. And he advised the President in a memorandum that he should rescind the Geneva Conventions, which are the core of international humanitarian law and are part of U.S. law. He should rescind them because that would, as Gonzalez put it, reduce the threat of prosecution for violation of the Geneva Convention.
And President Bush, I guess maybe on the same advice, declared that American soldiers were exempt from being covered by the international court for anything that happened in Afghanistan or Iraq.
That's correct. The U.S. refuses to participate and, in fact, insists that other countries agree not to allow the U.S. to be sent. That's over the objections of the large majority of the population. But the case of the Geneva Conventions is more extreme, because the Geneva Conventions would mean that the commanders in Washington are liable. So, for example, when the U.S. Invaded Fallujah, you could read on the front pages of the newspapers that the first target was the Fallujah General Hospital, where patients were ripped from their beds, thrown on the floor, handcuffed, the guards standing over them, doctors too. There's a picture of that on the front page of the New York Times. It wasn't hidden. Well, the Geneva Conventions say very explicitly that it's a war crime not to protect and defend any medical facility. That means that the commanders in Washington were guilty of grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, which under U.S. law, War Crimes Act of 1996, passed by a Republican Congress, under U.S. law, that actually leads to a call for the death sentence.
Professor Chomsky, we have to take a 6:50 break, and then we'll conclude with two questions. Why aren't you in jail by the Homeland Security Office? And what advice do you give African Americans as far as political involvement in American politics? We'll be right back with Professor Noam Chomsky, the distinguished professor of MIT, Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Why aren't you in jail, sir, for aiding and abetting, given the things you've said?
Because there are many respects in which this is really a great country. One of them is that people have won and have achieved a very high level of freedom. So freedom of speech in the United States is protected beyond any country in the world that I know of. Now, it wasn't a gift. It's not in the Bill of Rights. In fact, it really wasn't granted fully or seriously until the 1960s, and that was in the course of the Civil Rights Movement. That's how rights are won. They're won by popular struggle, and that's happened for centuries in the United States, and a lot of them have been won. Freedom of speech, it really was the achievement of the Civil Rights Movement to have brought the Supreme Court to set a high standard on protection of freedom of speech. It's 1964. We should be proud of that and grateful for it. We have an unusual legacy of freedom, and we should use it.
What about the second question, Professor Chomsky? The African Americans have been, since Reconstruction, a democratic stalwart of the Democratic Party. Yet there have been problems and setbacks, affirmative action, etc. What advice would you give to African Americans who want to be as successful as other groups in the political arena?
You know, it's a long, hard struggle for every. African Americans were, first of all, obviously slaves, and then after the Second World War, in the North, they were basically immigrants. The mechanization of agriculture in the South and the industrial development of the North led to a huge immigration from the South. They're sort of the latest wave of immigrants into the United States. But there's a difference from other waves. So when my father came back in 1913 from southeastern Europe, this was a growing industrial economy. He could get a job in a sweatshop, and he could work his way up and finally get to college, and his son could be me. I could become a professor, and my brother could become a doctor, and so on. Well, when the black immigrants, basically immigrants, came to the North in the 1940s, and it was okay during the war, there were a lot of jobs, but afterwards, so this was not a growing industrial economy anymore. There was no way to absorb growing class of manufacturing workers. And on top of that, of course, is the extreme racism, which is, wasn't any fun for Jews either, but it's much worse for blacks.
In many ways, the two people had parallel experiences.
And that makes it much harder to fight their way out of it. And the effects of slavery, which is one of the worst modern crimes, still exist. Just take a look at the statistics of people in jail. The drug war, for example, is mainly a war against poor blacks, and in fact, it was more or less designed that way.
So basically, you're saying African Americans need to look at the nature of the economy now and strategize based on that, rather than a open market, free market economy.
First of all, there is nothing remotely like a free market economy. The rich and the powerful would never permit it for a minute. The Bush administration doesn't believe in it. The corporations wouldn't accept it. Market principles are imposed on the poor. The rich are protected by state power from the effects of markets.
The subsidies, what have you.
And people should find out the truth about that. As to what measures they should take, well, I can't really give tactical advice. People have to figure that out in their own circumstances. But there have been great achievements of black struggle, which have made this a much more civilized country. I mentioned one of them before.
I hate this, but we have to conclude. I am exhilarated. My heart is pounding out of my chest, having been given this opportunity. Would you like to leave an email address?
Yeah, sure.
What is that email address, Professor Chomsky?
You can imagine, it's just my last name, Chomsky.
That's Chomsky.
Right, at MIT, which is where I teach, .edu. EDU is for all educational institutions. So it's Chomsky at MIT.edu. Just what anyone would guess.
Professor Chomsky, I'm going to part of planning for the launching of a new Islamic World Studies program, and we're going to send you an invitation to have you be the keynote speaker at that event, and we will be making du'as, prayers very hard that you will accept. In the meantime, thank you so much. God bless you and your family, and I love your informed courage, and you're an example for all of us.
Thank you very much.
And I know your father would be proud of you.
I hope so.
Take care, Professor Noam Chomsky.
It's good to talk to you.
Goodbye. Well, that blew my mind. I don't know what it did for you, but I really think that guy, along with many others, is somebody that you needed to meet, and I'm glad that you had the opportunity to do that through the facilities of WCEV Radio 1450 AM here in Cicero, Illinois, through Radio Islam, which is a production of Sound Vision Incorporated. I'll mention a couple of books of Professor Chomsky as we conclude. Profit Over People, Common Good, The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism, Manufacturing Consent, Propaganda and the Public Mind, Secret Lies and Democracy, and What Uncle Sam Really Wants. You've been listening to this program of Radio Islam at 1450 AM. It's a call-in talk show from 6 to 7 p.m. every day, 7 days a week. And this has been Wednesday night, and this is Frederick Aldine. For more information about contact www.radioislam.com.